I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
What are we looking at today, Rob?
We actually tried to podcast this earlier. For some reason, we lost it or
something.
It's a story called The General's Head, written in 1931 is the day we're looking at.
Yeah.
By Shi Zhecun. Now, Shi Zhecun was a really peculiar writer.
Yeah, he's kind of coming out of this Shanghai modernity movement in the 1930s that is in some ways a reaction against the May 4th movement, which we've talked about a lot, which is more centered on Beijing, the capital in the north. Shanghai is the center of economic activity. At the time that Shi Zhecun is writing, it's one of the largest cities in the world.
Yeah.
And it's this kind of multicultural, cosmopolitan entrepot. A lot of people don't realize this, but this is actually like a huge center for Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany and Russia. It's a site of a real modern experience, both for China, and that modernity is getting transmitted back into the rest of China, and also for a lot of other.
And a lot of the May 4th writers were trying to center their works either in the countryside or in sort of forgotten communities, the sort of fringes of society.
Yeah.
Or not even the fringes, because the countryside would have been the majority of people in China. A lot of the writers coming out of Shanghai, like Zhang Ailing, for example.
They didn't do that. Yeah.
They didn't do that. They're like, we're from Shanghai, that's who we are, that's what we're writing. And you also then tend to get a lot more experimentation, not just in terms of subject matter, but narrative. So Shi Zhecun, well, he's weird.
He's incredibly experimental, incredibly weird.
Very weird.
This story that we're looking at, The General's Head, is also very, very weird. It ends with the narrator's head being lopped off, and he still keeps telling his story. Should we just go ahead and jump into
I think we should just jump into the story, yeah, because I think it's a weird one. It's a lot of fun.
Tell us what this story is about. Can you give us an outline?
So it's set during the Tang Dynasty, so, 7th century-ish, and a general for the army of the Tang court is sent out to what we would now think of as the border of Tibet to deal with incursions. There's people coming from Tibet into what was then the Tang Empire, and he's sent out to quell it. The problem is that he himself is from the minority group of that region.
And that minority group is called what?
They're called the Tufan in the story.
Okay, so they're essentially like Tibetans, or they're sort of proto-Tibetans.
Yeah, but the general is of that group,
or he's half.
I think he's half Tufan. I think about it. In any case, he has roots in the community, and so he's sent out to combat these people. And for about the first half of the story, he's marching at the head of the army out there. His thoughts are being narrated to us, and he's questioning, is this a good idea? Am I betraying my people? He arrives on the border with his army. There's some mixed feelings about their being there from the part of the locals. And then one of the local women is raped by a member of the army.
Han Chinese
soldier. And the general decides to make an example of him and lops his head off as punishment. And then he continues to question, should I...
Whose side am I on?
Whose side am I on here? He's also fallen in love with a local woman. This is all taking place over the span of just a few days, which is weird.
And it's all taking place inside his head.
It's all taking place...
is mostly inside his head.
Very much interior. We're seeing his thoughts throughout this whole thing. But before he can make up his mind about whose side he's officially on, they're attacked, the whole group, the villagers included, by the people from across the border, the Tufan. And so he rides out to fight them, tells the woman he's fallen in love with that he'll return. He gets into a pitched battle with the leader of the other group. They each cut each other's heads off at the same time. And in the last about 2 pages of the story, the general's body picks up a head, which turns out to be the head of not the rebel, but the opposing general, puts it on his own head.
Can't see anything.
Walks back to where he came from, finds the girl he fell in love with.
Starts trying to wash off the blood that's all on him, and
then falls down dead eventually. It's kind of a early version of what would later be called magical realism.
Yeah, it's very avant-garde. Even reading it today, it feels very avant-garde. It would be very difficult for someone to write this kind of story today. Maybe a Borges could.
Yeah.
We were discussing this before we started, but some of the interesting issues are questions of identity. What's going on with identity?
Well, I think there's a lot of stuff going on with identity. I mean, the first level of this, obviously, is ethnic identity. So you have a person who's ethnically Tufan, or ethnically of a group that's on the border, the fringes.
I have to emphasize this. He's half Han Chinese, half Tufan
Right.
or something. He's mixed.
Mhm.
So he's questioning his own identity and what relationship he has to that community who he's about to slaughter.
But he serves the Tang court. So does that mean because he's sworn loyalty to the Tang emperor, that takes precedence over his ethnicity?
That's the question that kind of lingers in his head throughout the whole story.
Yeah, it dogs him throughout. And it's peculiar because this story is being written... First of all, I should point out, there's not a lot of stories written in the Republican period, as we call it, from about 1912 to 1949, in which the story's set somewhere different, like in the Tang court, for example.
It's a very strange move.
I mean, one of the things that modern quote unquote fiction is supposed to do in China is everything's set now, today's villages, today's cities, whatever. To set something in ancient China is really peculiar.
Yeah, I can't think of any story in Republican-era literature, just off the top of my head, that is doing that.
Right.
This is unique in that way.
But it's also, at this point, too, Japan is beginning to really assert itself in China. And in almost the same time when this story is being published, we have the Mukden incident in which the Japanese army sort of stages an ambush as a pretext for invading Manchuria, which they do, I think, in September of 1931, same year as his story. After this, there's a lot more patriotism happening in China because obviously, having been invaded, will do that.
But this story is really questioning,
Yes.
what does it even mean to be Chinese?
Because it's pointing out, okay, before we forget, this whole thing that we call China at one point did not include a lot of the territories that we now think of as China. Back in the Tang Dynasty, you didn't just have this one single empire. You had kingdoms fighting against each other. Some took over, some lost, etc. So the notion of Chineseness is very, very fluid.
And it's very much constructed, and that's kind of the thing that the story is pointing out. And by constructed, we just mean it's manipulatable. It's something that some person came up with and said, let's do this thing.
Yeah, it's synthetic. It's not organic. Yeah. You're not just born Chinese and now everything's okay.
Yeah, someone stamps it onto you. It's not a birthmark where we turn over the baby and go, oh, he's Chinese, look at that.
Yeah. And this is a peculiar thing to be bringing up, although it's peculiar in one way, it's not in another way, because as you pointed out at the beginning,
Shanghai is
Shanghai,
multicultural city. Shanghai, a lot of the policemen in Shanghai are actually Sikhs from India. On daily life, they're confronted with the question of what does it mean to be Chinese?
Or does it even matter?
Does it mean anything? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is the other thing, is there, I think there would have been people in Shanghai going, I don't really care. This is me right now in this city. I feel like I'm a Shanghai Ren more than I'm Chinese.
Yeah.
And this is something that troubled people like Lu Xun. Because Lu Xun, he would have been writing a good decade or so before this story.
But he was still alive.
Yeah, he was still alive.
Story was published.
But the questions he's dealing with a decade or so earlier are: look, we're being pushed out of the way by the rest of the world. The only way we're going to be able to combat this is to have some sort of unified and maybe even uniform culture. Whereas someone like Shi Zhecun is going, no, I don't think so.
I want to push back against that.
Okay.
I think Lu Xun is constructing a Chinese nation by writing these stories that he writes and by forcing his readers to look in the eyes of whatever narrator he is creating. Mm-hmm. He is, to a certain degree, creating this nation.
Yeah.
The nation as discourse. And I think what Shi Zhecun is doing, he's asking the question, if the nation is just a discourse, does it really matter? It's not. It's synthetic, like you said.
Mm-hmm. If it's something that can, and I think you're right. I think Lu Xun is trying to create the nation through a kind of shared experience of reading, of being read, even. Mm. Whereas Shi Zhecun is arguably taking the same idea and flipping it on its head. Because Shi Zhecun is also saying that narrative has a creative function in national life and political life, but not necessarily the way Lu Xun is seeing it.
I think Lu Xun sees the ability of a narrative to create a nation as a way to save that nation.
Yeah.
But implied in kind of Lu Xun's thinking is that the nation should be saved.
Yeah.
I think Shi Zhecun is saying, who cares if China disappears? I'm not any more Chinese than I am Tu Fan.
I don't know that I'd go quite so far as to say he doesn't care if the Chinese nation disappears.
I think that he would say that I think that's the question that the text is posing. I'm not sure how Shi Zhecun feels personally.
Well, and again, you've got, there's the question for Shi Zhecun of, are we first Chinese, or are we actually a part of a global network of things? And so to be Chinese means equally to interact with, like you say, Sikh police officers or English bankers or French bakers. Does that also mean to be Chinese? Because that's what it means for us here in Shanghai. So that may not mean what it means for someone farming in Shandong province, but it certainly is here. And so he's really pointing out sort of a multiple identity problem. Not even problem, but situation.
Identity is a kind of multiplicity.
Yeah, and this is why one of the reasons the story is so peculiar. There's this aspect of the general questioning, what does it mean to be this versus this? Then there's a section where the army he's leading...
That's actually one of my favorite sections.
No, it is mine too. The first person narrative switches to the army, but it's the whole army.
So we should go back and fill the listener in. So this story is incredibly interesting, and particularly this passage that Rob is pointing out, partially because the narrator is actually changing heads.
Yeah.
If we take the narrator as the person who sees the story happening and physically tells us, there is actually a changing of heads going on in the narrator. And it's oftentimes ambiguous where it's actually happening. There will be one section that's told as a third-person narrator, and then it will switch into first-person narration, just kind of within the same sentence. It's incredibly an odd move. But the one passage that Rob is talking about is there's this passage where the whole Chinese army, the Tang army of Han Chinese folks that the general is leading, suddenly starts thinking. And it ends kind of, essentially, it's the army is thinking about plundering a bunch of stuff. There's this kind of sexuality and monetary gain all going on that you would expect from a lot of pre-modern armies. And it ends with the line, 兵士们差不多全是这样的想着, which translates literally as, the soldiers all pretty much were thinking like this.
Yeah.
And there's this question like, what does it even mean narratorily for a bunch of people to have the same thoughts?
Yeah.
And I think that goes back into our question of what does it mean to be Chinese? What does it mean to be part of a nation? Because a nation is essentially a bunch of people who share the same story. They share the same narration. But is that even possible for us to all have this same thought process? It doesn't make sense.
It's almost satirical. It's almost him going, right, we're all having the same thought. Here, let me show you what it's like if that actually happened. I'll narrate the whole army having literally the same thought. That's what you're talking about?
Absolutely. But it's also kind of playing around with notions of kind of Freudian psychology. Freud is very big at this time in China. He's still fairly big in Europe and the US, but he's also quite big in China. And there's this exploration of what does it mean to think? Psychologically, on a psychological level, can 1,000, 10,000 people all share a thought?
Or impulse, or
something.
Whatever.
Can they all have the same desire?
Right. And this doesn't continue frequently in the story. It's only a couple of isolated passages. The rest of the story is either the general or the woman he meets among the Tu Fan on the border.
Yeah.
And so if we start off with the question of ethnicity, what does it actually mean to be Chinese or whatever else? Maybe it doesn't even matter. The next part of the question is we've been talking about, what does it mean to be a thinking individual?
Yeah.
What does that even mean? What I find really fascinating about the resolution of all of this is that Shi Zhecun does not say, I'll tell you what it is. It is thinking the following thing. It is as though the only possible resolution to this is just the unforeseen circumstances of life itself.
I think there is no resolution offered, and that's because of the ending. Because essentially it just gets so crazy when both heads get lopped off and one of them continues to think and continues to speak. And it's just kind of completely, it's like you said, it's a satire of narration itself.
I had to bring this in because I was just talking about this from some of the students that I'm teaching this term. We were talking about sort of the frontiers of modern science. There is a proposal, and I forget where. I think it's for someone who has a lot of brain damage to have an actual head transplant. And then, of course, the question is, but how does that person's not the same person anymore? Well, are they? But this is like an early precursor to that. What if not only is the question of identity very fluid, what if you physically switched heads? What would happen?
Yeah.
Right? Well, what if this guy who just can't seem to figure out who he is and what he needs to do, what if he literally took the head of someone from the culture he's grappling with and walked around with that for a while? And the fascinating thing about the story is, we don't know. He ends and just dies with this other head, but he's walked around with it long enough for it to be at least feasible. And so this whole story is this weird back and forth with the individual who's thinking and thinking and thinking, and a whole mass of people who are thinking. And then you have a culture that seems fairly fixed, like the Tang Court. Only the people there in the Tang Court also come from other places, and maybe they're not really...
Yeah, the Tang itself, the Tang emperors are actually partially descended from another ethnic group, a non-quote-unquote Chinese, what we would call today Han Chinese ethnic group. The Tang is an interesting spot to locate this.
And the style of the story itself reflects this kind of multiplicity. And it's one of the things that I think distinguishes a lot of the fiction coming out of Shanghai as almost a schizophrenic narrative, where if someone like Lu Xun is seeking to create a kind of Chineseness through also the creation of a vernacular written language, someone like Shi Zhecun is going, actually, we're all mixed, perhaps even hopelessly entangled, and narrative has to be able to show that. So the narrative itself is going to be all mixed up. It's going to be first person, third person, the same first person with a different head. Why not?
I think, however, he does offer an answer to that question of what does it mean to be Chinese to a certain degree, or what does it mean in a broader sense to be part of a nation. And that's towards the end of the story when the Tufan attack his army, and he's still kind of trying to figure out whether or not he should fight the Tufan or join the Tufan as his kind of ancient, as his ancestors. He just kind of like drops all that thinking and eventually says, no, to heck with it. I'm a part of this army. I'm leading this army. We're being attacked. It doesn't matter what they are blood-wise.
Yeah.
My group that I have chosen is being attacked, and so to heck with it, we're going to battle.
And I think that's what I was trying to get at earlier. I think you put it better. There's a sense in which who you are is not something defined. It's action.
It's something that's chosen.
It's what you do, right? So, especially in a place like Shanghai, even if you had a firm definition of what it meant to be Chinese, within a generation it would have to change anyway, because things are so mingled that you can't do that. So essentially he's saying to be Chinese or to be an ethnic group or whatever you are is to act in a certain way, not to be a certain way.
And to a certain degree, you can choose what you are.
And what's also fascinating there is, yes, the general does choose, but he has the choice made for him.
Yeah.
Because he's being attacked, what does he do? He can just run away, but, well, he's got these villagers around him, so he has to protect them. All right, well, let's just go protect them. That's what I'll do.
Two things about that. So first off, I think Shi Zhecun is suggesting that this decision about identity is a political rather than like a decision based on ethnicity.
Intellectual.
Political, intellectual, something like that. But also that identity comes when we are attacked by outsiders. That's the point where we stop asking these questions and just go, yep, this is me. I'm doing this. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an interesting place to bring it back to, because when we first introduced this story, we said this is written at a point where the Japanese are beginning to tear China apart. The Japanese are beginning to start their invasion of Manchuria, which itself has this interesting ethnic history. Is it Chinese? Well, it was actually largely controlled by the Manchurians before the Qing dynasty, and the Manchurians took over. They took over the rest of China. It wasn't like Manchuria became part of China, but China became part of Manchuria, essentially. And there's this kind of ambiguity that the Japanese are going to play on in the 1930s and 1940s and use that to their advantage politically. But these questions of identity kind of go away, or they become much clearer, I guess. The ambiguity disappears when you're attacked from the outside. And I think that's, to a certain degree, that's what this story is evoking. Again, the attack by the Japanese came after this story was written, but it is something that is kind of festering in the minds of a lot of folks who are reading things and you know, not even thinking about the Japanese, but in Shanghai, British, French, American, non-Chinese governments owned territory. They controlled land in those things. So people in Shanghai were confronted with the reality of this kind of external threat.
And so, to some extent, if Lu Xun is saying, we are Chinese because of who we are, the following things, Shi Zhecun is saying, we are Chinese because of who we're not. We're not those people. We can draw a clear line between us and them because they're attacking us. There may not be any other difference, but that's what we're dealing with. And what's interesting there is that it's then left open. Okay, well, what happens when they go away? Well, because his story is set way in the past, the suggestion is, well, maybe we go back to where we started. This is not a thing that will last forever, but it could be clear for the moment.
I think that's a great place to end it. All right, I'll call it. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.